ask you, is it just perhaps true that at the end of time, this harlot church is going to impose something having to do with sun worship? You say, well, I don't know any church in the world that practices sun worship. Well, I know some pagan religions in the world that practice sun worship, but, any Christian church that openly says you need to worship the sun, I don't know any. But you see, at the end of time, what happened literally in the Old Testament has a symbolic meaning at the end of time. Is it just perhaps true that what's going to happen at the end of time is not that people are going to worship the sun, but they're going to worship on the day of the sun? That came into the Christian church, by the way, from the sun-worshiping Romans. It can be proved historically. And I'm going to show you a quotation from John Paul II where he says that the church Christianized the day of the sun. As if you can do something like that. You say, well, Pastor, it's not the same thing to worship the sun as it is to worship on the day of the sun, or what people call Sunday. Let me tell you that it is the same thing in principle. You say, how's that? Let me ask you, who created the sun? God did. Did He create the sun for worship? No, it's a secular object, right? It's to give us light. So He did not create the sun for worship. So what happens if you convert the sun into an object of worship? What is that called? Idolatry. Now let me ask you, who created the first day of the week? God did. Did He create it for worship? No, it's one of the working days, folks. Did He create the first day of the week for worship? No. So what happens if you convert it into a holy day of worship? It is still idolatry. It doesn't matter if it's an object or if it's a day. Anything that man makes for worship that God did not make for worship is idolatry. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, as we studied last time, God is going to have a people who are faithful to Him that are going to sigh and cry because of these abominations, this specific one that we've talked about last. Notice Ezekiel chapter 9. Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 1. Then He called out in my hearing. This is immediately after He describes the group of leaders that were worshiping the sun in the temple of God, by the way. These are the followers of God that are doing this. It's not the pagans. Immediately after that, it speaks about a group who are going to get a seal on their forehead. They're opposite. Notice verse 1. Then He called out in my hearing with a loud voice saying, let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand. And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces north, each with his battle axe in his hand. One man among them was clothed with linen. I don't have time to prove this, but it's Jesus Christ who is clothed with linen and had a writer's inkhorn at his side. In other words, something to seal with. They went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. And He called to the man clothed with linen who had the writer's inkhorn at his side. And the Lord said to him, go through the midst of the city. Which city? Jerusalem. Is this a sealing of God's people or is it a sealing of the pagans? This is happening among God's people. They're worshiping the sun, but there's a group that don't, and they need to receive a seal. Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it. Let me ask you, was there a group that sighed and cried about the abominations and did not participate in those abominations, who refused to worship the sun god? Absolutely. And what did they receive? The mark where? On their foreheads. Is there a mark on the forehead in Revelation? Is it just possible that it has something to do with sun worship? We'll come back to that.